What's going on, you guys? My name's Ty Knots and welcome to Top 5 Unknowns, 5 terrifying night shift stories. Number 5. It was a normal Friday night like any other. I was up late watching late night TV, but when I went to go get some snacks for my viewing, I noticed the cupboard was bare. So I decided to make a quick run to a local gas station to pick up some cheap midnight snacks. It was late and it was the only place within walking distance that was still open. But when I got to the gas station, there was a man there with crazy hair. He looked young, but his skin was oddly weather-beaten for someone looking so young. His eyes had these yellow spots on them. Unnerving to say the least, but he was the cashier, so I didn't have much reason to be afraid of him yet. So I grabbed my stuff, lay it out on the counter, and start fishing around for my debit card. The cashier then smiles at me and says, "You like those Gatorades?" I'll never forget those teeth. The only way I could describe them was pure evil, almost like they didn't fit in his head. I nod politely, praying silently that that'll be the end of it. He then rings up my groceries and I scan my card. He then says, "Hold on, I need to replace the printer paper." He then walks back to somewhere I couldn't see, but I look at the card scanner and there's no printer feed on it at all. So fair enough, maybe I don't understand how the receipt scanners work. Maybe I don't know where to look for the receipt to come out. But then I see the other guy at the door and he was trying to lock it. My red flags start going off like crazy and I grab my card and leave my groceries there, rushing to the door. I'm pounding on it like crazy and the other guy's trying to get me to stop. I hear the cashier coming back, so I panic and push the guy out of the way, giving me the opportunity to unlock the door and rush out. I haven't been back to that gas station since, and now I just buy my groceries ahead of time. Number 4. It was winter 2012 and I was 18 or 19 at the time. I was working at a petrol station in an average-sized town in England. It started out like any other night. I serve people, clean up, do stock, the average night shift work. The place where I worked was situated across the street from a pub and an alley was running beside it that led into a housing estate. Around 3 or 4 a.m., as I'm finishing up cleaning a set of shelves, I notice a figure standing in the alley, just enough to hide his face. I initially brushed it off as somebody waiting for a taxi, as it seemed harmless enough. I sat down at my chair behind the counter and looked at my phone, playing some games for a bit. But when I look up, it was 5 a.m. and he was still there. To make my situation worse, after 5 a.m. there's hardly any traffic or passers-by. I was safe, however, as I was locked in until morning. I stared back in a trance, trying to keep eye contact on whatever he would do next. After a while, I needed to use the toilet, so I went and came back thinking that he may have walked off, but he was still there. I then decided to wait inside until my coworker arrived rather than finishing up my nightly duties. It got to about 6 a.m. and the figure faded back into the alley and I didn't see him for the rest of my shift. When my coworker arrived, it was still dark, but I usually walk home. This night, I got a taxi. I told my coworkers about the experience, but they said that they'd never noticed anyone lurking around or experienced anything similar. Thankfully, I've never seen the guy again, and I hope to keep it that way. Number 3. I work at a small grocery store in a pretty small town. I usually work in the mornings until 3 p.m., but we needed help for the late shift, so I stayed until closing time at 10 p.m. We have a bin full of $1 t-shirts that I keep close to the front. They're all shirts with some sort of manufacturing defect that we sell throughout the summer. But right before we closed that night, I was walking around the front of the store and smelled something awful. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but the only thing I could think is that someone hid something gross in the bin. I started to dig through the pile when all of a sudden a grown man explodes from the pile, falls over onto the floor, gets back up, and makes a break for the door. The door wasn't locked yet, so he just pried it open and ran on through to the parking lot and down the street. When I looked back into the bin, I could see and smell that his feces and urine had been left behind. I had no idea what he was intending to do, but we called police and the manager. This by far was the weirdest thing I've ever seen at work. Number 2. I served in the Marines from age 18 to 28 until I was honorably discharged due to pinched nerves in my back, which led to surgery. Thankfully, surgery worked for me, and while I recuperated, I took a job as a driver for an assisted living facility. I worked for 2 sister companies that were about 35 to 45 minutes away from each other, and I would drive meds, patients, etc. between the 2 facilities. Usually I worked in the day, however the night shift driver suddenly quit without warning, and I was asked to fill in while they found somebody to cover his shift. I was asked to drive some meds between Site A and Site B. No biggie, and I happily hopped in the van and headed to Site B. In order to get to Site B, I had to drive through a heavily forested area. It was spooky, but as a former Marine and someone who grew up in the boondocks, I don't scare very easily. So I'm listening to an audiobook when I hear something rustling around in the back of the van. Now, a month prior to this, a squirrel had somehow made its way inside of the van, so I thought it may have been another one, and the sound stopped, so I shrugged it off. So I'm driving through the forest, lost in thought, when something bites me hard on the back of my neck. I swerve the car, almost smashing into another car. My heart's beating 1,000,000 miles a minute, and I immediately pull over. I run out of the car and open the back. I'm expecting to see a rabid squirrel or something, but sitting there with a blank expression on her face is Agnes, a woman who had severe mental issues and was a resident at one of the facilities. She was muttering the words, "I'm not supposed to be here." She'd bit my neck, but what was more disturbing was that she had a knitting needle in her hand that she must have taken from another resident. I ended up calling 2 of the staff members who worked at the ward she lived in, and they ended up coming to get her. They talked her down into giving them the needle and managed to get her back to the facility. I had to go get my bite looked at and ended up quitting just a few months later after another crazy incident. I stayed far away from Agnes for the rest of my time there. Number 1. I work in a restaurant where there's usually only 2 people working the night shift. We also have a lot of female employees, including myself, and almost all of us are under the age of 18. So 2 days ago, while I was at work, a man came in and went straight to the bathroom. It happens a lot, so I didn't think anything of it. But 30 minutes later, he finally emerged and his eyes were extremely red. I'd completely forgotten about him by then, but when I saw him, I had this weird feeling of unease wash over me. He came up to me and asked what time we closed. He had a very thick Spanish accent and it was hard for me to understand. I told him our closing time and he responded with, "I should come back later then," and walked out. He then stood in our parking lot for about 10 minutes, eventually walking over to a nearby grocery store. I was pretty freaked out and told my coworker what had happened. We both decided to check the bathroom to see why he was in there for so long, but luckily we didn't find anything. I texted a friend and told her about the weird encounter, and she told me a story about a sex trafficking incident that took place not even 10 minutes away. After hearing that, I called my parents and asked if they would sit in the parking lot after we closed, so that I could take out the trash and then head to the car. When I got home, my stepdad told me he saw a man that matched the description just sitting out beside the grocery store nearby. We called the owner of the store and alerted him. He said he would check the cameras and ask whoever was working that night if they remembered him. I don't know what the man's intentions truly were, but I've never been scared more by a customer like that. From what I saw, I'm pretty sure he was on foot too, which is strange since we were right beside a highway. After this, the sheriff offered to have an officer hang out in the parking lot during the night shift from then on. As far as I know, the guy's still out there somewhere, but he hasn't come back. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep updated with our videos.